समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
So, what is happening on the Russia Ukraine war front? The answer is several things all at once, with major implications for the rest of the world, including for India. But before I tell you more, I have to make an appeal. Please consider becoming subscribers to ThePrint if you haven't already. You know, it takes resources and humongous efforts to bring you such quality content at the click of your finger. And your help and contribution counts immensely to keep the momentum going. So coming back, President Volodymyr Zelensky is once again in Washington to meet Donald Trump. And this time, it is a recalibrated Trump administration from the one Ukraine encountered 8 months ago at the Oval Office fiasco in February this year. In fact, one saw a much more confident Zelensky offering drones to the US in exchange of Tomahawk missiles. Now, does that mean that those missiles are coming? Not so easily. Meanwhile, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of War, has made his first ever visit to Ramstein, the US airbase in Germany that once hosted the Defense Contact Group's key meetings on military aid for Ukraine. Now, Ramstein, once a star stage for former Secretary of Defense, which is now called the Department of War, Lloyd Austin's coalition diplomacy had faded into obscurity after Trump's return to office, and with his repositioning on America's role in European security. Since taking charge, Trump has re-engineered the very concept of the American backstop, warning allies that US security guarantees do not come cheap and do not come free. To maintain them, he insists, allies must do more themselves, and that has been the Trump bill. Now, for Europe, doing more has translated into pledging at least 5% of their GDPs to NATO and purchasing US weapons for Ukraine. And yet, while Hegseth's visit grabbed headlines, Washington's contribution so far has been largely rhetorical and transactional. The pledged military aid to Ukraine continues to come and will continue to come entirely from European money. Now, in the Indo-Pacific, Trump's do more message has been more subdued, and it reflects in the softened tone of once hawkish voices like Elbridge Colby's. The Middle East, by contrast, remains the stage for the never-ending Trump show, a fusion of personal diplomacy, of improvisation, spectacle, and divided opinions. But for now, let's start from Europe because we are discussing what is going on in the war. So what is the familiar Trump pattern there? You know, Trump's old pattern of over-promising and under-delivering seems to have returned. After weeks of calling Russia a paper tiger, he's again back to talking to both Zelensky, whom he has met in Washington, and Putin, whom he plans to see in Hungary soon. Trump seems to have decided against sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, a decision some see, especially Putin, of course, as symbolic of escalation. Now, frankly, this is no major setback for Ukraine per se. You know why? Because a few dozen Tomahawks would hardly alter the battlefield, and only the US right now can operate their complicated launch systems, which would mean boots on the ground. And Zelensky's team sort of knows this. What they truly want and hope for is continuity. That Washington's position does not tilt towards Putin's narrative, and therefore, Ukraine's position is to keep the relationship with the US transactional and rooted in immediate benefits for both sides. And I think that's a smart strategy. And for the record, Trump himself has said that the Russian war is not going well for Russia, citing its economy being in trouble. Now, when you look at the numbers, the Russian economy is showing strain. Despite the Central Bank of Russia's efforts to curb inflation by adjusting interest rates continuously, the declining oil and gas revenues and spiraling war costs have produced a fiscal deficit that now continually eats into their sovereign wealth fund. taxes have risen, export restrictions have been imposed on refined fuels, and domestic fuel prices are managed through rationing. All while Ukraine's daily strikes on Russian refineries have cut capacity by nearly 30%, and that's quite unprecedented. Ukraine's domestic weapons production too has expanded, but its ability, and that is Ukraine's Achilles heel, Ukraine's ability to defend energy infrastructure remains limited by shortages of Patriot systems and interceptors. So both sides are adapting, but Ukraine's vulnerability, especially in the energy grid in the face of approaching winter, remains rather worrisome. The thing is, as long as Trump sells to Europe to keep arming Ukraine and Zelensky manages to keep US policy from drifting too much towards Putin's narrative, Europe would play along, no matter how hard the choice, because this is about their own continent. That often means indulging Trump's theatrics. I'm sure you all saw the recent Egypt Peace Summit on Israel and Gaza, where the Trump show was attended by many European leaders just to stay in his good books. But what does it tell us about the war first? That 2025 so far has been yet another autumn of unvictory. Russia's summer offensive has not really worked. Now, Europeans call it the 1+1+1 dilemma, which is Russia gaining 1% of Ukrainian territory in 1,000 days at the cost of nearly 1 million casualties. And this is what Trump keeps talking about too lately, if you've been hearing what he's saying. And yet, Europe's satisfaction kind of stops there, because Russia's capacity to absorb losses and Putin's desperation to claim a tangible victory both remain greater for now. But the rest of the world, however, yearns for closure, and yet an outcome that can be defined as victory or defeat remains elusive. Tales of resilience and ingenuity abound, but none of those have changed the battlefield equation decisively for either side. Now, it is evident that the Russian army cannot perhaps deliver a military victory, and Trump cannot force Zelensky into submission as long as European financial support continues. It has been tried and it has failed. Now, whether Putin admits it or not, 4 years into the war, he also has no path to a decisive win. As another winter approaches, Moscow faces what I call yet another year of unvictory, a kind of a stalemate. It must sell at home as triumph, rebranded as strategic space, wrapped in the elastic semantics of denazification and demilitarization. Remember, these were never clearly defined. In order to win, Putin must outlast European solidarity that he correctly sees as fragile. But the point is that it's not fragile enough. So how does all this affect India? And I know you're waiting for this. Naturally, New Delhi does not want a humiliated Russia. Every path to stalemate is going to be painful, but a Russian defeat would be far worse for Indian interests. That said, India has misread the war and is not preparing for its far-reaching implications enough. And this misreading is not about its pragmatic neutrality. Neutrality remains a sound policy under multi-alignment. But the misreading lies in underestimating the long-term consequences of a grinding war of attrition. Now, strategic discussions in Delhi have been rather fixated and focused on whether Russia can be defeated in a war of attrition. And often they cite Russian doggedness in the two world wars. But that's the whole point. The binary of a victory or a defeat misses the real questions. So the real question is what this prolonged attrition does to India's reliable defense partner. As the war drags on, India's arms and oil partnership with Moscow is going to suffer. Since the invasion began in 2022, India has placed no new major defense orders with Russia. Hopes of acquiring the two remaining or additional S-400 systems or the S-500 systems, as well as Russia's offers on co-producing the Sukhoi 57 fighter jets, all of this depends on one prerequisite. The war has to come to an end. Unless sanctions are lifted, none of this can proceed. The Trump administration has imposed new sanctions, that's true, but it hasn't lifted any sanctions either. Now, in such a scenario, Russia's dependence on China for chips, components, and technology has only deepened. And this is growing concern for New Delhi, which is often expressed behind closed doors, and our policies have started to reflect it too. The MOD, for instance, has already directed our armed forces, to screen imported equipment for Chinese parts and tech. Now, this classified decision was first made public in 2024. I think it was September 2024. A recent case involving scraping emergency procurement of drones found to contain Chinese components, which were listed as German, shows how pervasive this risk has become and how unaffordable this is getting for India. Next, look at this scenario. Do you think India would prefer the recycled S-400 systems from Russia previously sold to Turkey? Or can it ignore the worrying integration of Chinese technology into Russian hardware and software? Ideally, New Delhi would prefer that Western sanctions are eased and Russia is reintegrated, even if partially, into the global economy and especially the defense value chains. Now, that situation would allow India once again to reap the benefits of multi-alignment without costs and security risks and sanctions and so on. And one more thing. From India's perspective, whether Russia retains or loses the 19% of Ukrainian territory it still controls is kind of immaterial. What matters to us is the steady weakening of Russian influence across theaters. Look at the Caucasus, look at Africa, look at the Middle East, especially Syria and Iran. And I know, by the way, the case of Al-Shara in Moscow recently. Now, this situation has many more layers than what meets the eye, but that's another story for another day, and I promise to come back to it soon. But coming back to India, we need to reinterpret our multi-alignment. The question is how? It is increasingly likely that India could have to reduce imports of Russian crude in the months ahead. Now, Trump's recent boast, I'm sure you know this, of a zero purchases promise from Prime Minister Modi was neither confirmed nor completely rebutted by the Ministry of External Affairs. What all they said was that they are not aware of it. Now, as far as India's imports of Russian crude oil is concerned, market logic will ultimately prevail in this case. When costs outweigh benefits, refiners are going to adjust. It's basically business. Disproportionately dense and repetitive strategic discussions on the matter actually take away our attention from the other real question, and that is the Beijing factor. India must better analyze what Beijing's position ultimately means for the Ukraine war. Among all players, China is the one that has emerged as the sole winner. Access to deeply discounted Russian oil and gas has dovetailed perfectly with Beijing's economic ambitions. The Moscow-Beijing partnership has never been more synchronized, and yet it will be a mistake to imagine that this is an unbreakable alliance. Russia and China have their own tensions as well. And here is something for which I want your attention. China, in my reading, has no desire for the war to end quickly. Peace or Russian victory would mean losing privileged access to cheap Russian energy, both oil and gas. India's own discounts, now we know, averaged at about $3 to $5 per barrel, far below what China enjoys. And as Ukrainian drones hammer Russian refineries now, as well as the hubs, cutting output by 30%, Moscow's first ports of call for refined imports have been, guess where? China and Belarus. Beijing thus enjoys a double advantage. It props up Russia just enough to prevent a classic defeat while profiting from Moscow's dependency, buying crude oil and gas at bargain rates and selling refined products back to Russia at a premium. It is becoming uncomfortably evident that while New Delhi would loathe a defeated Russia, Beijing will make sure Moscow never secures a decisive victory either, keeping it confined to a state of managed unvictory to prioritize its own economic interests. And there is another dimension. See who is usurping the market vacuum as Russia's weapon exports are dwindling. The answer is China. So, the larger challenge for New Delhi lies in recalibrating its multi-alignment under a Trump presidency and so much global uncertainty. And in the beginning of the section, I had asked how, if you remember. So, the correct measure must be hierarchy of interests, not posture. India's balancing act among Washington, Brussels, Moscow, Beijing, and its neighborhood will require hierarchy of interests-based recalibration. not by choice, but by necessity. And in a previous piece, I've argued how compartmentalization of foreign policy would help India here. In New Delhi, opinions remain divided on whether Prime Minister Modi was right to skip the Egypt summit. Some said it was best to avoid an awkward encounter with Pakistan's Shehbaz Sharif, singing charades to Trump at the Trump show. Others say India missed an opportunity to engage Trump and assert influence in a relevant theatre. Now, whichever side you choose to support, it is a reminder that personality-driven politics can eclipse interest-driven strategy. In Europe, whether we like it or we don't, the reverse has been true. Their leaders have seldom let posture outrun their most pressing interests. As for India, PM Modi might soon have a meeting with Trump in Malaysia with fresh ground for prioritizing India's interests, and we'll see how it goes. But for now, the world remains caught in yet another autumn of unvictory in the Ukraine war, a season that neither side could claim and one that India must navigate with quiet precision and objectivity rather than emphatic reference to neutrality and posturing. I'll be back to discuss this and more. Stay tuned.